Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Today, before we continue on with the downtown, we're going to be hopping over the freeway back to the waterfront, and we're going to be building a convention center inspired by the Duluth Entertainment Convention Center area. As you can see here, it consists of a couple of arenas and various other buildings for housing different kinds of events. So without further ado, let's jump in and try to cobble some of these assets that I selected together into something that looks realistic. I probably spent a couple of hours just digging through various keyword searches on the workshop, looking for things that kind of resembled the sorts of buildings that you find here, and I really couldn't find much. So I had to adjust the aesthetics of it a little bit, and it ends up looking a little bit more of kind of a gray brutalist style than the real thing in Duluth, which has a bit more of a brighter color scheme to it, although it does have kind of that plain look in various areas. But I pretty quickly found out that having these various assets match each other was more important than having some of them match the inspiration in Duluth. Because I did have a few failed attempts at trying to make something a little bit more accurate that had a slightly brighter color scheme in it. I really couldn't get it to work. So I found that going for the assets that were a little plainer made it a lot easier to have them look like a cohesive unit compared to some of the brighter and more interesting assets. Not that these assets that I ended up using aren't interesting in their own right. I think they are, but they do feel a little bit more utilitarian in their design. Some of these assets that I really liked here, I ended up not being able to use, like this kind of modular set here, which I think had a really good convention center kind of look to it. But I found that using all these small pieces and trying to assemble them into larger buildings really wasn't working. So I tried to specialize things a little bit more and use more pre-built assets. So like this large reddish building would be a more modern addition to the convention center side of things. And we have the Mormon church office building, as you might expect in a convention center. But I just thought that had the right look for a symphony hall, so that's what that's going to be. And then we have these two arenas on either side. One of them over that I placed earlier over there is from Vancouver, and then this one I think is based on a German auditorium. I could be wrong about that. But then once I get these arranged in something that fits into this road network I built, I just take a few very, very generic looking buildings and fill in some of these empty gaps to make them look like slightly larger and more well-connected buildings. I'm just going to fill in some of these empty areas with roads. These are all going to serve as access areas for different parking areas and service lots, that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to go ahead and add some blocks into these PO buildings to make them functional. So we have a couple of arenas from the campus DLC. I'm going to put an event generator into the convention center area, and I'm going to make sure to adjust all of the spawn points for these so that the vehicles are mostly going to access around back, where we're going to add, like I said, all these parking and service lot areas later on. Off camera, I also added a couple of commercial and office blocks to represent the administration and service jobs that you'd find here. You may have noticed that there's this streetcar track that runs right in front of the Rogers Arena here, so I'm going to add a streetcar line. This is going to connect the convention center area to downtown when we eventually get to downtown. That being said, most people aren't going to take public transportation to get here. So even though most of the visitors are going to be driving in their cars and passing through this roundabout to access one of the many parking lots that I plopped down, some people are also probably going to be walking from downtown. So in Duluth, they have their Skywalk network connected up to the convention center, and I thought it would be pretty cool to do the exact same thing here. I'm just going to use the same technique that I used in prior episodes to cross the freeway, using this adaptive network's pedestrian path, and running that all the way from the downtown bus center across the freeway and over here. I'm also going to take this and run it all the way through the convention center so that people can actually use it to traverse between the different buildings, which I was kind of skeptical that they actually would, but people do actually end up using it, as you'll see later in the episode and in the cinematics. So that's actually a pretty cool thing, and I'm happy that that actually worked out. I thought it looked a little strange to have these be open air, because the whole point is that they're heated and you can use them in the winter, and that's not really effective if they are just open air. So I'm going to use IMT to add some glass panes along the exterior of these, and then run the network throughout the remaining parts of the convention center. I'm trying to line it up when I can with actual entrances and exits that are built into these buildings, just to make it a little bit more realistic. We have this little nubbin of the skywalk here, which I thought was kind of interesting. Maybe it was added after the fact, so it feels kind of patched on, or maybe it was just a design choice when it was originally put in. But I kind of liked this little open area here, so I decided to add some grass and foliage and flowers down there as well. I also wanted to unify this area, so I'm going to add this roof texture network, and I think that blends in a little bit better with the tones of gray on the roof surrounding it, rather than the one that was built into the asset. Of course, it looks a little plain on its own, so I'm just going to add a few various ventilation thingies across here. And we're going to get to work on some of the more interesting pedestrian infrastructure. So we have the quay wall along here. I'm thinking that this was probably originally like an old dock, so we're going to have these old dock textures along here. But then in remodeling this area for its new uses, they've added some interesting things. So we have a bridge that crosses over from the Canal Park area over to the convention center area. The one in Duluth is pretty cool, and I tried to replicate it using a whole bunch of props and networks in PO, and it just looked like so I'm not going to do that. And instead, I decided to just give up, close out of the game, and go to the workshop and let one of the amazing asset creators there do all the work. So I downloaded this pack of Dutch bridges, which I'll link down in the description in case you want to use it. These look fantastic. I just need to extend it out a little bit with PO to make it seem a little bit more to scale in this context. And then I'm just going to fill in the rest of these details to make it look integrated into the area. So I think that looks a lot better than the one I was trying to make from scratch. I think if there's a moral to this story, it's that you shouldn't try to build your own pedestrian bridges using random props because you're lazy and don't want to close out of the game to access the workshop. The rest of the pedestrian infrastructure is a lot simpler than that. Basically just this meandering little path that runs along the old wharf. Obviously the point here is not a direct point from A to B. It's more something where you can take your time and walk along this snaking path. And it's kind of ugly now, but we're going to add in some trees and benches and stuff to spruce it up a little bit in a minute. I thought instead of trying to manually plop everything like usual, letting IMT do most of the work would be beneficial here. So I'm just going to create a little template with these nice fancy street lamps, some planters here and there, and clipping some bushes or trees into those as well, and some of these nice benches. I'm just going to take that segment and copy and paste it all the way along here, just flipping the segments as needed so that we don't have these things hovering out over the water. I thought the trees might benefit a little bit more from some hand-placed TLC instead of using IMT, so I'm just going to very quickly take some younger trees and run these at regular intervals along the sidewalk, and then I'm going to have a few clusters of other types of trees as well, just to offset the regularity of the smaller trees a little bit. Finally, I just wanted to pay a little bit of attention to the vicinity immediately around the arena. So I'm going to have this long pathway here leading up to these large stairs in the Rogers Arena. I'm going to use Node Controller to extend it out here, which for some reason gets rid of the filler texture, but I actually kind of like how it branches off into the gray angled texture at the side. So I'm just going to keep that happy accident there. I think that actually looks really clean. And then at regular intervals, I'm going to take these concrete paver things and stamp those out so we have some little pathways to access the paths, and then we also leave some green space in between as well. I'm going to add some trees there later. Same thing on the other side. I guess this would probably count as the front of the arena since that's where the streetcar stops. I'm going to do the same thing here, just running the pavement up to the doors that are built into the asset. A lot of the remaining detailing that we have to do are some of these back areas where deliveries are made or where there are accessible parking spots, that kind of stuff. So this one in particular here butts up against the back of the Rogers Arena. Now the real arena in Vancouver has all this kind of really interesting elevated infrastructure around it. So as a result, you get this kind of weird shape with all these bare walls. So I decided to take advantage of that and use this giant bare wall to have a little delivery area here with some dogging bays or whatever you'd call them for truck deliveries. Unfortunately, all the footage here got corrupted. So here's the after portion. And as if to make up for all this concrete, I'm going to plop down a bunch of trees in these little grass planter areas that are in between all these concrete paths. I also want to do a little bit of detailing around front here. Just trying to fill in some of these areas with some green space and some pedestrian crossings as well. Over by the Symphony Hall, we have this little appendage of a turnaround area where people could get picked up or dropped off. So I'm just going to detail up the surrounding surfaces with some expansion joints. I'm also going to take these pillars here and just bulk them up a little bit with some concrete pillar pieces. I thought this would be the kind of place where you'd have this like kind of very simple brutalist building, but then you'd have these nice strings of ivy running up and down the pillars as well, which I think is kind of an interesting contrast. It feels very kind of artsy and museum or symphony hall like. While I was copying and lining up these doors, I encountered this really weird glitch with PO where the axes here went totally off kilter. They shifted by 45 degrees, so I couldn't actually line things up in the way I wanted to. Not sure why that happened, and the only way I found to fix it was to completely close out of the game and reload it, which I'm sure, as you know, is always a lot of fun when you're playing with 100 mods and a few thousand assets, but anyway, it's not a big deal. I got it fixed eventually. I'm also going to put a couple of single parking spots here so that we can have people coming and going from the pickup and drop-off area. I thought this secondary arena had most of the details that it already needed, but I thought I'd add a couple of customizations to it, like a little planter at the front and a couple of little Minnesota nods to cover up these billboards. Something we haven't really touched on yet, mostly just because the asset has really nice built-in details already is the movie theater, which is kind of part of this whole district. So I wanted to add a couple of movie posters. Like usually you'll see these lined up along the front of a large chain theater like this. So I have just a couple of posters here representing various movies that totally go together really well and make sense and aren't weird at all. And that's pretty much it. Just got to do a little bit of lighting, some smaller lamps along the pedestrian routes, and some larger lampposts along the roads. And with that, we are done with the Amaranth Bay Entertainment District, more commonly known as a bed. I hope you enjoyed this build, and I can't wait to see you on the next one. We're going to be moving on to the skyline of the city. Thanks for watching. Bye.